From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. You know, if there's a founding principle for this show, it's that we celebrate the great work of Chicago journalists. And today they're really kind of everywhere in the legacy newsrooms, at smaller, digital-only virtual newsrooms, at magazines, podcast shops. They're turning out more content than anybody can possibly consume in a lifetime. And as we wind down Chicago Newsroom, we want to spend some time at the intersection of journalism with activism. The advent of live streaming in everybody's pocket has made everyone a kind of a journalist in a weird way, and in some cases even an activist, at least for a few minutes. But the man we're talking with today has been exposing corruption, brutality, cover-ups, and official misconduct for more than 50 years. And we all owe him a great debt for his work. Flint Taylor was a founder of the People's Law Office in the late 1960s, and he was associated early on with the Black Panther movement when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were murdered in that infamous raid on December 4th, 1969. Flint and his associates at the Northwestern Law School swung into action, and it occurs to me that when we say today that they were murdered, it's only because of a 13-year-long legal battle these young Northwestern law students waged that history doesn't quietly just close the book on it and say this incident was an all-out assault on law enforcement by dangerous radicals that was suppressed by heroic police officers. And then it was in the 80s that Flint Taylor and the People's Law Office came into prominence as they uncovered what might be the most repugnant stain on the Chicago Police Department in its history, Burge. Now, you know that name, and you've heard all about the torture chamber he and the others ran at Area 2. But the reason you and all the rest of us know about John Burge is because of a 30-year-old war that was waged against the highest level officials in Chicago to uncover this operation and obtain reparations for the torture victims. It's all in the book. This book, Flint Taylor has written in great detail a life story of battling the machine for over half a century. It's called The Torture Machine, and I'm honored to have you at the table, Flint. Thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here and honored to be with you two.
Good. I've also invited Thom Clark to join us today. Thom Clark is a great friend of this show, and he's also spent his professional lifetime fighting for access to Chicago's media for activists and community groups and celebrating their work. He was a co-founder of the Community Media Workshop with a mission not unlike what we have here at Community Access Television, giving power to ordinary people by getting their voices heard. And as we said, prior to the digital revolution, it was almost impossible for ordinary citizens to be heard or seen in the media. And Thom seemed like the perfect guy to ask to join this conversation today, and he's right here.
Thank you, Ken.
It's so great to have you
Good
back
to see
on
you again.
Chicago Newsroom. So we've got this book, we've got this guy, we got a lot to talk about, and I just want to have a conversation about where it's all at. Give us some guidance here. Do you want to talk about the Fred Hampton piece first, or do you want to talk about the Burge piece first?
I'm game for either. Chronologically, the Hampton case comes first.
You chose to do that in the book, to do Hampton first.
I did.
You talked about standing in the blood of Fred Hampton.
That's right. As you mentioned, Northwestern students and, of course, People's Law Office, which had just started months before, the lawyers, the young lawyers there, we all mobilized to deal with when our client, Fred Hampton, had been murdered in his bed along with Mark Clark. And as a young law student, I went there to the apartment because the police had left it open. Perhaps because they were afraid there'd be an uprising in the black community when dawn arrived a few minutes after the raid. Perhaps because they were so arrogant, that Ed Hanrahan and his people were very arrogant about that they could tell the story of a police shootout with the Panthers firing many shots and get away with it. But for whatever reason, we went there because it was open, and we started to take evidence for the next 10 days.
I got to say that right away, I mean, like...
It's a riveting opening chapter.
You're in your first chapter, and immediately it's like, what? you just walked into this scene, and you started like picking up evidence and hauling it away?
Well, we had Mike Gray. You may remember Mike, a filmmaker who made The Murder of Fred Hampton based on what happened here. We had him filming. We had, ultimately, we were able to get ballistics experts and to line up the bullet holes. But yes, we were able to walk in, and Skip Andrew, who was one of the young lawyers at People's Law Office, had the presence of mind to organize all of this. Sent some of us to the apartment, others to the jail where Deborah Johnson, now Akua Najiri, was with her 8.5-month pregnant son. Yeah, so that's what we did.
You had a powerful story to tell, but you also engaged the media, as it was at the time, all the way through this saga. They were kind of important partners. Even in the beginning with Brian Boyer sort of saying, oh, this police story isn't quite adding up. After the Tribune
Brian
had
Boyer
published it.
was a Sun-Times reporter at
Right.
that point, right?
He was.
For a few moments until he left because the paper wasn't following the facts. They were, you know, as happens so often with stories like this, the official party line is what became conventional wisdom, except it wasn't.
Right. Well, there are a lot of sub stories in this book, and one of them is to follow the media through good and bad.
Right.
And also, as I think you alluded to with Tom's work, and of course with your work, there's a narrative to be told. And there's always the dominant narrative, and that's what Hanrahan and Daley's people told in the Hampton case, and that's what Richie Daley and the others told in the torture case. And what we were self-consciously about, and continue to be, is not only to fight in court, but to fight for that narrative, to fight for the true narrative and what we like to call people's narrative. Because if we don't tell it and we don't bring it to the public, then that dominant narrative, as they say, those who win the wars tell the story, right? And well, here we are with a narrative that's changed about the Hampton case, going from a shootout all the way to a police and FBI assassination. And of course, in the torture cases, we go from a situation where they're talking about, you know, convicted cop killer Andrew Wilson alleges police brutality against decorated Vietnam veteran and Commander John Burge, to notorious torturer dies. Daley's role in it is told as well. So that's the kind of change in the narrative that I think we like to think we had something to do with.
So how did Chicago become the capital of wrongful convictions?
Well, it became not only the capital of wrongful convictions, but the capital of torture. I think that, and they're intertwined. I mean, and we also had the overlay of the death penalty. And all of that kind of wound together in terms of what we were fighting and what so many other lawyers and activists and people are survivors of torture, and of course their families and the people in jail, all fighting those interrelated battles. And how did it become that? Well, I think we have to go back even farther in history than I do, which is 1969, where I come in on the scene to look at Chicago and its history, not only in terms of police, in terms of racism, but in terms of the courts, because we're looking at a continuum here, not just starting with the police, but it doesn't end with the police. Obviously, it ends in the court system, and it goes farther back, of course, than police, to the whole economic situation and poverty and all of that.
We've been celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 1990 so-called race riots.
Yes.
So, you know, it's been around since then, but I think what astonished me reading your book, which kind of reminded me of sort of an episodic police serial of some kind, except the tables have been turned about, you know, who we're really talking about, what personal narratives we were talking about. But here we have, if you look at the surnames of the police and the prosecutors, a bunch of, I'm going to assume second, maybe third generation Irish, Italian surnames going after these, you know, can I put it this way, free men of color? All these years after the Civil War, can constantly, without being challenged. It's kind of mind-blowing in this immigrant city to think about how the tables got turned in terms of those dynamics, in terms of who was in charge of enforcing.
Well, I think looking historically, and I think I do make reference to it in the book, you can take it on the one hand, torture, all the way back to slavery and the slave patrols and the torture that happened on the plantations and to the escaped slaves, and then you go all the way through to lynching, of course, Jim Crow, and then you come to torture in Chicago. So that's one train. The other train that we see is the international train. We see that Burge was in Vietnam. We see that Burge was on a POW camp in Vietnam where they were electric shocking Vietnamese POWs. So you see that he brought that inhumanity, that dehumanization from Vietnam to the south side of Chicago. So you see those two trains, which you might think are separate, but also I think, you know, you can also analyze how those both come together and run through the history, not only the 100-year history, but now we're talking almost 200 years, 150 years.
You obviously, the book is called The Torture Machine, which is I guess kind of a dual purpose.
It definitely.
You're talking about the political machine, and you're also talking about this thing.
Yes.
Which I found it interesting that you were able to trace it back to to Burge's time in Vietnam. He was apparently kind of a techie for his day, and he kind of understood electrical work and electronics, and he studied with the torturers who were torturing Vietnamese in Vietnam, and brought his technology back with him to Chicago.
He did. He did. Now, this isn't the first time in history that we see that some kind of device like this black box and cattle prods and other kinds of electrical devices have been used to torture suspects, to torture people, whether they be enslaved people or, of course, people on the south side of Chicago. But it really was very much honed in Vietnam and used repeatedly on the POW camps. And in a way, of all the torture that we hear about in Vietnam, it was probably some of the lesser torture. They were throwing people out of airplanes. And then the kind of torture, you know, that they're killing people. But yeah, this is a device that we heard about first in this country called the Tucker telephone. And that was in Arkansas in a prison, and the warden's name was Tucker. And he used to bring the prisoners in, and when he wanted to punish them or get some information, he had the generator. He didn't have it in a box, but he had it on the wall, and he'd wire up the prisoners. And so they called it the Tucker telephone. Because
these were used to power field telephones in Vietnam, right?
That's right.
So you had to crank them to get the voltage going.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also very convenient to just have those wires and attach them to various parts of people's bodies.
Exactly.
Like earlobes and genitals and so forth.
That's what the evidence shows in the torture cases here in Chicago, yes.
So I'm trying to draw a line here where you begin to hear these awful stories about what's going on. We've kind of jumped across now from Fred Hampton to John Burge, but how did you actually start getting involved in this? What drew you into the Burge thing?
Well, of course, we did spend 13 years fighting the Fred Hampton case. So we had a certain reputation in terms of fighting cases that seemed to be lost causes, where racism and police violence was paramount in the cases. So when Andrew Wilson and his brother Jackie Wilson, two persons notorious in this city because of being arrested and ultimately convicted for killing two white police officers, when they were tortured brutally by John Burge and his men, that was known at that time, but it was like completely, the judges didn't care about it. These were two cop killers, so they were convicted on their confessions, and one sent to death row and the other for life in prison. A few years later, Andrew Wilson, the man who was on death row for being the triggerman in the shootings, filed his own pro se lawsuit in federal court. He had a first-grade education, but he got a jailhouse lawyer to help him file a civil rights case, saying, I was tortured, that's wrong, it violated my rights. No lawyer wanted to represent him. They appointed lawyers for him. Those lawyers bowed out. So ultimately, Andrew Wilson got the word in the penitentiary, hey, why don't you give Taylor and his people a call? They might just take the case.
They might be willing to do this.
And we talked about it, because going into this 30, 35 years ago, who would have thought there was any chance of winning a civil rights case for a convicted cop killer versus a decorated Vietnam commander? But we took it on because we all thought, and I assume many other people agree, that no one should be tortured. Doesn't matter if they're a convicted cop killer or someone as innocent as you two grabbed off the street. In any event, that we took the case, and the rest is history, so to speak.
The rest is written in this book. Yeah.
I couldn't help but think, Flint, how this case might develop if it were happening today. People's Law Office has built its reputation on a nation of laws, that there's no one above the law, but I think things have shifted in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm wondering if we can rely on the courts the way you have to try to bring justice and some equity to people who have been mistreated.
Well, I can't imagine what you're referring to, but perhaps you're talking about the president and all that seeps out from that madness. But when you think about it, we're not really saying that we didn't really rely on the judicial system. There was much more to it, I mean, we had Judge Perry, a good old Alabama judge who became a federal judge here, who threw myself and my partner Jeff Haas in jail for fighting the Hampton case, and of course threw the case out after 18 months of trial. So it wasn't
He was
like
the guy who convicted Harold Washington, wasn't he, for his?
Yes.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He did. That's right.
Yeah.
Little known fact. But yes. So part of what we were doing actually was, and a very important part was bringing out the evidence that we were getting through the judicial system to the public, and dealing with that narrative. And ultimately, we did receive some kind of justice, although no one in the Fred Hampton case. I mean, he was murdered in his bed. No one did a day in jail for that. When they did finally charge Hanrahan and the cops with obstruction of justice, not with murder, Judge Romiti walked them out the week before the election in 1972. You all go back that far with me.
Yeah.
And remember, Hanrahan thought that would get him elected, but in fact it lost him the election. The people spoke.
In a big way.
They did, and that movement, of course, led to, in many respects, to Harold being elected.
If you look at it with the length of history we have, you can say, that probably had something to do with it.
Yes, definitely.
The thing that I find permeates this entire book is your innate skill at being a good lawyer, but also understanding media. You have an intense understanding of media's thirst and hunger for a story, but at the same time, kind of lack of willingness to do really hard work to go in and get that story. So if you arrive at the front door with a bushel basket full of good stuff, you're going to be able to get a lot of attention. I mean, I hope that doesn't sound like I'm demeaning your work, but I'm saying that it's an incredible skill you have of mixing being a lawyer and being a media star.
I don't know about the second part, being a media star.
Well,
but
you were on TV a lot.
The way it started out really was in the Fred Hampton case, and it was by necessity, because we're getting these documents that show that, in fact, there was an FBI conspiracy under COINTELPRO to destroy the Panthers and to murder Hampton and Clark, and they're all secret. And so we had to devise a way to get these extremely important documents to the public, because in a way we knew, at least in the trial, this judge, we were never going to win this case initially. But what we could do is actually bring forth the truth of really what happened here. And so what we came up with, and we didn't take a genius to figure this out, was if we put these documents into evidence with the press, with people like Rob Warden sitting there. Maury Posley at that time was another reporter covering the trial. So then, when they're in evidence, they're public. So then we could share them with Maury and Bob McClory, another wonderful reporter who was covering the case. And then they could write about it. And then it was out there. So that was a technique. Not that these documents were certainly important. It wasn't like we were just putting them in for the purpose of getting to the press, but it had that dual purpose. And so that because of those events and that trial, it put us in a position of being able to talk. We knew about these documents, so we could talk about them. We could talk to the press. They became, they trusted us after a while because they saw that what we had, the goods, and when we told them something, we knew what we were talking about.
Yeah.
And so when we get to the torture cases, we had gone to school on that. And at first, nobody was listening except John Conroy.
I'm glad you brought him up, yes.
Yeah, and Rob.
Right.
But John Conroy of the Reader is sitting in court every day for 8 weeks in the first Wilson trial, and then when that was mistried, a hung jury, we went back to trial in front of another insane judge, Judge Duff, and John covered those 16 weeks, and then he wrote the quintessential investigative story on the torture cases called The House of Screams.
Yeah.
But then we see his reaction, right? We understand both sides of the media because John thought he, quite rightly, had written a story that would break the whole scandal wide open.
Yeah.
And then we see Mike Miner, the editor of the Reader, writing a piece three weeks later called Silent to the Screams. And it's about John and his frustration and cynicism about the fact that Sun Times said, well, you've written about it, we're not going to.
This was SOP at the time, when if the Reader broke something, the other media outlets just ran away.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's the alternative weekly, so it's not real news.
Right.
Yeah.
Your ability to make real news out of, you know, really important stories, I think Ken is correct. It was a very critical role in getting the facts of the case out, because you were up against the establishment in more ways than one. And crooked judges, prosecutors who were wired into the police department, et cetera. I imagine doing this work for 35 years, when the whole Laquan McDonald thing came around, a little bit of deja vu?
Yes. People have pointed out to me the differences with regard to Laquan McDonald versus, let's say, the Fred Hampton assassination, but the similarities are very important as well. To see
the systemic similarities.
Yes, the
are
systemic
still there.
similarities and the fact, the kind of violence that you know, Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed, but here's a young man walking down the street with really not threatening anybody, and he gets shot 16 times. So you say, in a way, how much different is the level of police violence in the Hampton case versus the Laquan McDonald case? Of course, there wasn't a whole conspiracy, government conspiracy behind the murder of Laquan McDonald, but after he's murdered by Van Dyke, then we see the similarities become more paramount in the cover-up. And we see, because of the video, we see that cover-up uncovered in a way that we had to fight years and decades to uncover in the Hampton and the torture cases. But we also see the judiciary again, right? We see that if you get a Remedi, who was the judge in the Hanrahan case, who completely wired to the machine, you're going to get off. You take a judge. But they couldn't, Van Dyke couldn't trust Judge Gahn because his reputation wasn't completely in line with the machine and with the police. So they took a jury, and a jury convicted Van Dyke. But then you turn around to the cover-up guys, and they got Dominica Stevenson. And I know Dominica Stevenson because she took a tortured confession from a 13-year-old client of mine named Marcus Wiggins.
Oh, okay.
And of course, she was very close to the state's attorney turned defense lawyer who represented one of the 3 cops who were charged with the cover-up. And she walked them out, not unlike Ed Hanrahan was walked out. I mean, how have more things change, the more they stay the same.
Do you think there wasn't more public outrage, even as John Conroy is beginning to write about this, and more of us know what's really going on? Because, you know, these weren't great guys. They were kind of problematic. You know, they had shady backgrounds. So the public outcry just wasn't going to galvanize around unsympathetic victims.
Well, yes, and I think if we cut to the chase, there's a lot of racism involved in it too, and the attitudes, you know, yes, these are black criminals. Doesn't matter whether they did this crime, they did some other crime. We're in an era of law and order. We're in the Reagan administration for a lot of the torture. We have the child predator concept that the Clintons put forward in the 90s as well. And so all of that, yes, makes the people who are being tortured, the people who are being wrongfully convicted, the people who are being put on death row, they're very unsympathetic people. They're people who look through the lens of racism as well. And so, yes, the outcry isn't there in the same way it might be either if it were on video or if...
And that's true for the public and for the media, right? I mean, the
Yes.
public in general just doesn't give a damn about this because, like you said, it's just some black criminal. But I think the same thing's happening, in the editorial rooms too, in the newspapers at that time, and radio and TV. It's like, well, why do we want to do a story about this? Nobody's going to want to hear about this. So you had this remarkable challenge in front of you of trying to bring people around to an appreciation for the value of the law, and also to at least acknowledge the idea that there are human rights involved in this. And I'm kind of amazed, frankly, that you were able to pull this off. I really am. I mean, it does read almost like a kind of a novel. I mean, it's back and forth, and the setbacks, major setbacks, and then a little bit of a forward here and there. We have not yet approached in this conversation the discussion of the role of mayoral politics in all of this. I mean, as you said, Hanrahan was running for mayor and was let go the day before, right?
The week before.
The week before the mayoral election.
Well,
and
he was
lost.
running for rerunning state's attorney at that point.
I'm sorry, running
Yeah.
for state's attorney, right.
He was the state's attorney. He was running for
the state's
re-election.
attorney, right, running for re-election. But this thing connects to mayoral politics in the fact that in many ways, but the name that we've never been allowed to mention, Richard M. Daley, mayor of the city of Chicago, was the state's attorney during most of this time, right? I think you said that you told the reporters in Washington, the quote is, Daley was Cook County State's attorney when 55 of the torture cases took place. He was aware of the torture from the beginning and did nothing about it. Address that for us.
Yes, well, we can go all the way back to the father, of course, and he escaped really any direct culpability in the Fred Hampton assassination, although all of his underlings and his anointed successor at that time, Ed Hanrahan, of course, was the one who was the mastermind on the state side, along with the FBI of the raid. But his son became state's attorney in 1980. And this is right in the middle of the torture scandal. The first cases that we ultimately documented started in 1972, when Burge got to Area 2 after Vietnam and a short stint as a patrolman. And it goes all the way to 1991, when Burge is ultimately suspended and fired. What was Richard Daley's role, M. Daley's role at that time? Well, he was state's attorney from 1980 to 1988. Then he's elected, in the wake of Harold and Gene Sawyer, he's elected mayor. And he's then mayor from 1989 to 2011. Well, what we see, that's pretty much the scope of the torture machine in terms of the police torture. And evidence was laid on his desk by Richie Brezak, police superintendent, 1982, about Andrew
Asking
Wilson.
for advice about how to proceed,
Yes.
right?
More than advice, he said, I'm the police superintendent. This doctor says that Andrew Wilson was tortured by Burge and his people, but I'm not going to do anything as police superintendent unless you, as the prosecutor, tell me to do it.
Yeah.
And of course, at that point, Daley could have investigated Burge. Burge would have been fired and perhaps prosecuted if we had a real and just world at that time by Daley. But instead, of course, he did nothing other than proceed to prosecute the torture victims. And as you get these numbers that I was telling the Washington Post, we had another 10 years of torture. And you can add up all those cases that happened from 1982 to 1991 and say, well, if Richie had acted on the doctor's evidence that was given to him in 82, we wouldn't have another 55 or 65 or how many ever, you know, it was who were tortured and sent to the penitentiary.
If I could just follow up on that, just one thing. One of the things that I found myself really confused about reading this is the role of Brezek, Richard Brezek, who was Burns' police commissioner. One minute you're looking at it, you're thinking, yeah, this guy had a soul. He was actually willing to maybe do something. He wrote some letters. He raised some issues. But then in the end, you look at it, and he really wasn't much of a hero in all of this either. How did you, now that you have some distance from it, what did you end up thinking of Richard Brezek?
Well, it is a little confusing and a little complicated. Obviously, as I just stated, he didn't show any courage at the time when he was given the evidence from Dr. Reba from Cook County Hospital.
We should explain what that is.
That was that evidence was the evidence. Dr. Reba saw Andrew Wilson, and he saw 15 physical injuries on him, and he also was told about the electric shock that Wilson was subjected to by Burge. And he was outraged by it. He was the head of Cermak Hospital, the jail hospital at the time. So he wrote a letter not only to Brezek as superintendent, but he CC'd George Dunn, and he CC'd, you know, just about everybody you could think of, other than Richie, and says, look, you've got to investigate this. Medically, this man was tortured. So that's when Brezek, who had it laid on his desk, decided he would send it to his political opponent at that time, because Brezek was Jane, as you said, Jane Byrne's guy, and Jane Byrne and Richie and Harold are all lining up to run against each other. And so he sends it over to Daley. And so he, at that point, shows no courage. Then we get to trial in the late 80s, and we have this letter. And we have some other evidence on Brezek. Brezek is a defendant in our case, and he's also represents the city's role because the judge wouldn't let us bring Richie into the case. And he gets on the stand, and I talk about it in the book. I cross-examine him a couple of different occasions, and he never really gives it up. He's still defending his role and the city's role. But later, after he goes through his personal scandal, which we don't need to get into here, he has a kind of come to Jesus moment. And he tells the press and ultimately us and that, yes, he knew this was torture, and God damn it, he did something about it. He called all his commanders in and read them the riot act. Okay. Well, maybe you did that, and certainly that helps the case to show that the city and the police superintendent really knew what was happening. And so from that point forward, he became someone who became more of a witness on the side of exposing police torture after all those years that he had done the opposite. So he's one of those figures that you can see
you really, depending on how you want to look at it. Yes.
Don't I recall that Brezek was an attorney?
He is an attorney. And
so could some of those memos have been driven by law school practice?
Well, I'll
it's
say
a rhetorical
this.
aside.
Yes, I understand. He is an attorney. He's a defense attorney now, and he's also been called as an expert witness on the side of police brutality victims. So Rich Brezek now is much more thought of in the present as someone who's more on the side of the victims of police brutality than someone who was perpetrating it.
Your descriptions of many, many years later, you actually get to go to Area 2 where all this was going on and go down in the basement, and it's long since been moved out of there, but you say how you recognize the space even though you'd never been there before. How does it happen that an operation like this can go on for so long, be so visible to so many people, and never I mean, just never be stopped. I mean, I just don't understand that part. Surely a police superintendent hearing that this was going on would say, if for no other reason than self-preservation,
Yeah.
oh, no, we ain't gonna have this happen on my watch. I want that stopped tomorrow, and I'm going over there to see it with my own eyes and make sure it's not there. This is the part that obviously you don't understand probably any better than I do, but I just don't get it. I just don't understand how it can happen.
Well, we're talking about Chicago. We're talking about a corrupt system. We're talking about a system where results are the end all and be all. And you have a detective who's getting confessions, sending people to death row.
He's really good at getting people to confess.
I wonder why. And so you look the other way. The code of silence, the police code of silence, keeps it so that the cops aren't going to tell on their fellow cops, even though if they're not in those rooms with him, the black cops are seeing the box. They're hearing the
screaming.
All of that. So what happens to this guy? Sergeant, lieutenant, commander, the fastest track in the history of the police department from patrolman to commander before he is fired.
Do I recall you saying that his ascent to commander was signed off on by Harold Washington? I believe I saw that in your book, didn't I? That Harold they ran it by him. And
Harold
he said
certainly
yes.
was the
He was mayor at the time.
He was the mayor during part of this time, and his superintendent, Fred Rice, knew some of what was going on. He was told by the OPS director at that time, Dave Fogel, about some of the instances of torture. I like to think that Harold didn't and wouldn't have condoned this if he knew about it. I think it was, kept probably from him. But you ask again how this could happen. Well, when the people who could stop this are implicated in it, Richie Daley as state's attorney, Brezek as superintendent, when they're implicated, when they don't act, then Richie, of course, becomes mayor, and so now he's in a position of further defending the actions of Burge, and so it goes like that. So code of silence, the implication of all of the powers that be. And when you do have an honest cop, there was a black cop named Bill Parker, who walked in on a scene in 1973, one of the first torture scenes while Burge was only a detective. And he walked in and he saw a black man handcuffed or kneeling by one of those old radiators that Andrew Wilson was ultimately burned on. And he saw Burge put something to the side, which he later thought was probably the torture machine. And they stopped doing what they were doing, but a sergeant comes in and says, "What are you doing in here?" And when he said something to the effect that he might do something about it, he was quickly transferred out of the area. So the message came early on, don't mess with this guy. And Burge must have had, and we never were able to really establish this. This is for, I guess, the next book or the next 50 years of investigation, what Daley and Burge's connections were. But Burge had to have clout. I mean, it wasn't, he was being rewarded for getting those confessions and putting those people in jail, but he also must have had some clout in places of power. And of course, the chief of detectives, Hanhart, ended up doing 10 years on his own, so we know who the guy that was the head of detectives was and what he was all about.
I lost count of how many police commissioners he worked under, but it was a number. It was 5 or more, right?
Well, he started out in '72, and we must have had, Rochford back then? I think Conless must have been gone by then, but we had Rochford, and we have, of course, Brezek. We have Fred Rice. We have Leroy Martin, who's a major actor in all of this. And then we have Rodriguez and Hillard. Hillard becomes a major actor in an aspect of the cover-up as well.
Can you draw a further line from this successful interrogator who gets all these convictions to our low murder solve rate today?
Good question.
Well, that is a good question. It seems to me, and I'm no...
Can we only police if we torture?
No, I think...
Oh, are you asking that since they apparently have stopped torturing people, then they're not getting confessions?
No, I don't think that's the reason. Do you? I think perhaps that the lack of confidence, to be kind, between the community with the police, because of the damage that this did to the community, the torture of persons, and not only damaged the people who were tortured, not only their mothers and fathers, but the whole community was damaged because of this, in the same way that the related idea of wrongful convictions has damaged the community, ruined any kind of confidence that the community would have in the police, and the racism, of course, that overlays all of it. So you have a community that's not cooperating with the police. It's a Hobson's choice, as they say, a catch-22. You're going to talk to the police, and the police, so they're not getting the cooperation, and their attitudes are not much different than Burge's, right? Well, it's just one. I don't even want to quote one of the things that he said about, you guys may remember it, about what he was asked at a bar, the racist comment he made about the people that he was investigating, the murders he was investigating. And so that attitude, I'm not sure has changed that much.
Well, I share Ken's dismay that I think that part of the outrage I felt and anger going through these chapters is, A, Richie clearly felt he could get away with it, and B, I don't understand why he didn't see both the public relations disaster as well as basic good police-community relations that went up in smoke because of the actions of his own forces. And it just seemed to be such a narrow silo kind of approach to a diverse city with many different kinds of people, and I think we've lost a generation of trust. What I want to lead up to is the current context where we have an incoming mayor and a consent decree, where the federal government's going to be looking at whether we can change the code of silence and a few other aspects of the way policing is done. What should we be looking for as citizens as this effort unfolds to make sure that maybe something does change in the culture?
Well, I think number one, we have to have community involvement at a very basic and fundamental level. I think there's some, obviously the community wants to do that, and I don't know to what degree this mayor is going to permit that or listen to it, or whether it's going to be lip service. I don't know in terms of the monitor how much the energy and perception in terms of the problems that monitor will bring, how much power that monitor will have to change things, how much will there be to change things. I mean, there are a lot of things on the table. One thing that I've been looking at recently is this idea of peer intervention. And it's been quite successful in New Orleans. And that is to convince cops that it's in their interest to intervene rather than to cover up. In other words, to overcome the code of silence. That, in fact, if you intervene to stop a cop from shooting someone else, a bad shooting, beating somebody, you're actually helping that cop, because that cop is in all likelihood going to go through some changes, even if he ultimately gets acquitted of the charge or doesn't get disciplined for it. It's going to change his life. It's going to change his reputation. It's going to change it's going to raise questions about what he or she is really doing as a police officer.
Not to mention that it'll help the police department.
Definitely,
right.
Definitely. But that's that culture, changing that culture. If you don't change the culture from the top down and also from the bottom up, you're going to have the same problems. Now, if you do, you still have people, and people who I respect, young people particularly, who say that the whole idea is to abolish the police.
Yeah.
no cop academy, that kind of thing. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and pontificate about how that is not an idea that should be pursued. But if we're talking within the context of changing the police rather than abolishing them, there's got to be some really radical ideas in terms of trying to change
I think
those things.
one of the strongest narratives among the police is that clueless old softies like us who sit around criticizing them haven't got a clue what a normal day is like for a cop, especially police officers who are assigned to really rough neighborhoods, where you literally do not know if you're going to come home that night. I mean, for some police officers, that's probably the reality. And for those for whom it's not, it's still something they like to think too. And it just becomes very easy to look at this kind of criticism and say, yeah, well, you ought to go out there and walk in our shoes for about a year and see how your attitude would change, bud.
All right. Well, then I would commend this book that I just finished reading, written by Michael Quinn, who was a 25-year vet of the Minneapolis police force and who is one of the trainers, or was in New Orleans, around this peer intervention. And he looks at it completely through the eyes of a cop, through the eyes of a cop who's been in life and death situations. And he then analyzes good police work and good police behavior in that light. And so, yes, I haven't walked the beat. I haven't had someone come on me with a knife, but he has. He has, and he's trained, and he's had partners who've done the right thing, and partners who've done the wrong thing, and partners who have intervened, and partners who have covered up, partners who've been fired, all of that. So if you want to know about a cop's view, a progressive cop's view of what you're talking about, I commend that book. And there are a number of former cops out there who are now experts in cases that we do. I just did a deposition down in Virginia of the former chief of the Charlotte Police Department for 16 years. And he was our witness in the Roby case. The Roby case is the white woman who was killed up here on the north side, who had serious mental issues, and she had a little knife in her hand and she was waving it around, and these two young rookie type cops decided to shoot her when she allegedly started to come at her. Well, this man, the former superintendent in Charlottesville, talked about alternatives, how they could have avoided killing her. And just yesterday, we see of another case, just made the video showing of a woman who was maybe in a mental crisis. And that's what we're seeing more and more and more of. It's not necessarily an assassination. We're dealing with situations where the cops need to be trained and restrained from killing people who have mental issues and who can be dealt with in a de-escalation rather than an escalation fashion.
Are there many unexonerated victims still in prison that you know of?
Sure. I mean,
we talking about scores, hundreds?
It's unknown, I mean, until you dig into the evidence in a particular case, until you strip away the evidence that was either tortured or coerced from them, when you strip away the witness who turns out to be blind and who sent someone to the penitentiary for 76 years. I mean, these are coming out every day. People like Maury Posley and others who actually track these cases after they're exposed. But the question is, how many of these, because there isn't a lawyer or an organization that's behind actually putting in the effort to get at these cases, how many more are there? Particularly, not only in Illinois, but across the South, and all of the people who are on death row in Alabama, Mississippi, and all those places.
How much have we paid out, we taxpayers?
Oh, yeah, good question.
Well, it depends on which numbers you're talking about.
Yeah.
In the torture cases, we paid out some, Gene Pincham, you remember Gene, of course, he called it pinstripe patronage.
Yes. Yeah.
And somehow all these big-time law firms end up getting paid by taxpayers to represent the bad guys, the Burges and the Dalys of the world in all these cases. Well, in the torture cases, cities paid out like $30 million for pinstripe patronage.
Okay.
The counties paid out another $15 to $16 million for special prosecutors who, of course, issued the whitewash report and now defend the Burge and them in the criminal cases where men are trying to get new trials. You add all that up, and then you put in the 90 or so million that begrudgingly has been paid to some of the men who have been tortured, and you get, in the torture cases, you get up around 140, $150 million that the torture...
That's almost 2 cop academies.
Yeah, there you go. But then when you get into all the wrongful conviction and police brutality cases, there's been studies last 10 years, you're getting up around close to $750 million
Right.
when you lump
That
everything in
Chicagoans have paid.
Yeah, it's all yeah, for police.
Which would cover next year's pension payment.
Yes.
You could almost build a Lincoln Yards for
You
that,
could.
right? Yeah. So, okay, talk about burying the lead. Buried off in the back of the book, you reveal that after all these years and years, and you tried, I don't know, what was it, 81 times or something to try to depose Richard M. Daley, and every time they outsmarted you or they outmaneuvered you, let's put it that way.
Oh, I would beg to differ on that characterization.
Well, you didn't get it. You didn't
Right,
get your way.
that's
So
true.
anyway, then, just buried in this is this paragraph on page 495. On January 24th, 2018, just a little while ago, after yet another secret hearing, Judge St. Eve ruled on Daley's renewed motion for a protective order concerning his deposition. The record simply said, defendant Daley's motion for protective order is granted in part and denied in part. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so 14 years after we first sought to depose him, I questioned Daley in several 90-minute sessions during the spring of 2018. You got to. Calm down, Ken. The content of the deposition, however, remains shrouded in court-ordered secrecy, leaving to speculation, given his age and medical condition, combined with his highly selective memory and his skilled propensity for obfuscation, which he had demonstrated time and time again through his political career, how or if he answered my questions. So you're not going to reveal that today here either, are you?
I'd love
Have
to.
you been redacted?
Yeah, sounds like the Mueller report.
I'd love to. I know there's some independent journalists that are contemplating the possibility of moving for that deposition to be public. I certainly think that it should be. It's not only a transcript, but it's video. It was video.
It was video.
And
Several 90 minutes, so there's a couple of hours of conversation with the mayor.
Can you explain to us non-lawyers why, other than white privilege and being a powerful politician, that would be a secret document?
Well, I think I can say that the arguments that were made by Daley's lawyers, paid for by the city, were that he, because of the medical condition that he that was publicly known, that being that he had a stroke, that it would be it protected his medical history or his medical condition, and therefore it was something that shouldn't be public. Now, I don't agree with that, and hopefully if someone writes the next book, they'll be able to see the deposition. But at this point, I just couldn't risk violating any court orders by talking about what did or didn't happen.
Was he hostile? Was he unhappy to see you? You can't even say that, can you?
I can't.
No, I'll bet he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I'm betting, and I'll just go out and say this, I'm betting that when we finally get to read that transcript, and believe me, it's one that I want to read, there'll be almost nothing in it because he's, as you say, he was skilled at obfuscation. So I doubt very much that he gave you anything. But of course, we'll not know for a while. So we got to wrap this up.
Yeah,
right?
I know. How about that?
Yeah.
The consent decree weighs in the back of my mind, and you made some good points earlier about what we need to be looking at. And of course, we're all waiting to see what the new mayor may or may not do. She's probably in a unique position, having served as one of Rahm's overseers of the police department, and some shifts began to happen during her role there. So she knows this issue, and she's a smart lawyer, if nothing else. Aren't the forces of the Code of Silence still going to be overwhelming, even for someone who got 75% of the vote to be our new mayor?
Well, it has to contemplate who that new superintendent is and how much independence that superintendent will bring to the table. And that would be a good place to start. As you know, Eddie Johnson, Rahm, rejected some independent African-American superintendents from around the country and took Eddie Johnson. Yeah. And so she needs to look closely at that. And then, yes, and then that person really is the one who's going to have to be in charge of rooting out the Code of Silence, the culture, the police culture, the racism, all of that. She recognized the racism in her report.
Yes.
On the other hand, we know that she was the head of the OPS. I deposed her. That's a whole other show we could go into. Wow. I had her under oath for 6 hours, shall we say. Was not, if you want to talk about hostility.
Really? Yeah.
But she also was the head of the police board. So we have two different hats pointing in different directions, and we hope that the hat that that faces forward and is the more, actually helped to get her elected, no doubt, is the one that she pursues. I felt like that she should speak out, and Preckwinkle should speak out on behalf of Kim Foxx because of the attacks from the FOP and the attacks from the right that are going on under the guise of the Smollett case.
Yeah. Flint, I'm sorry to say we're just completely out of time here. The book is The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. It's not the kind of thing you curl up by the fire and read. I must say, it can be a difficult book to read, but that's exactly why you do what you do. And
But because of the subject, not because of its craft.
Right. It is beautifully written. I must say, once you get into it, you can't let it go. And I want to make a personal statement here at the end of this, since we're almost over with Chicago Newsroom and everything else. During the 80s, from 1980 to the early 90s, I was program director at WBEZ, and I was responsible for a lot of the news coverage that the station was doing at that time. We barely touched this. We were barely aware of it during my tenure, and I feel terrible about that, having read this and knowing that this was all going on. And I will say, we had very limited resources in those days. There were only a couple of us. We were trying to do what we could. But we missed this story, and we are not the only ones in the media that did, and I'm sorry. I wish we had done better.
You're forgiven.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I had the great privilege of working with Hank DeZutter, who, along with Brian Boyer and the late Chris Chandler, who just passed away, were kind of my early lights about how to use investigative journalism, even when conventional wisdom wasn't telling the right story. So I felt pretty close to the story early on, but boy, it was not busting out. It was a very hard thing to get reporters to cover.
We really do have to go. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here, Thom Clark and Flint Taylor. I'm Ken Davis. We'll be back next week with another show here on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks to Dave Resnick for producing. And don't forget to go to this address to see all of our past shows. There are lots and lots of them, and you can listen to the SoundCloud version of them, too. See you next week on Chicago Newsroom. Bye for now.